Good morning. I'm Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished the paragraph on page 1364. We sum up what we learned and explain it a bit more. So the central theme is Malchus. Malchus is the quintessential Oyer HaMakabel. Its very personality. Words he used earlier was be'etzem muhusa hibchinis makabel. I'm reading on the second line on the paragraph on page 1355. Malchus be'etzem muhusa hibchinis makabel. He repeated this point several times. That's the essence of it all, explaining what is this role of a makabel. And frankly, when you read it and understand it, it really illuminates and in many ways even revolutionizes the very concept. Because usually we hear the word makabel, recipient, we see it as more of a passive state. We see it as almost an inferior state even. The mashpia is the real thing, the one that's giving, the influencer, the power, the one who controls, the one who dominates, the one who transmits, etc., the transmitter. The makabel, yes, we need a makabel, a recipient, but the recipient is like a keli. The oyer is the main thing, the keli is just a keli. But when you read through this, you realize that Malchus and makabel is a whole entity of its own. It's part of existence, and in many ways is equally, if not more important. I'm not going to compare because they're both created by God, and they're both part of Seder Shtalshlus. But like he explained back in the page I just mentioned, 1355, he said clearly that this is Kenu, that this is in Seder Shtalshlus. Zohar and Malchus are initially created by God. It's part of God's plan. It's to have a mashpia and a makabel. It's not due to any flaw or any correction needed in the Shtalshlus. That's the way it was always meant to be. And if you think about it, it makes total sense because God and the creation is essentially a mashpia and makabel. And if God created existence, even though God is the creator and he's the one that gives mashpia, and we're the recipients, the creator, the creation and the creatures. And yet there's a purpose. Why did God create a creation? Just to have someone to receive. So we know God wants a home in this world and he wants us to be part of creating that home. So the very essence and purpose of creation gets to the heart of mashpia and makabel too. So in many ways, you can then say that the makabel is in many ways mashpia, just as mashpia is. Yes, he does the makabel, the recipient does it in a different way because it's through receiving and through absorbing, but that's also not a passive effort. That's a very aggressive effort, actually. It takes a lot of work to to absorb and to receive. And that itself generates all kinds of other forces at work. So without going to all the details we learned, I just want to sum up since he's now coming to, and it's not the end of the concept, we're still going to be talking a lot about it, but since there's the end of a chapter in this regard, that the Oyer Makabel is a very powerful entity of its own. It's just created in a different way. It's created to be, like he says, using the words of Kabbalah, Netzala, Seit Shedish Kinukuda, like a Nukuda. It's only a point. The mashpia has 6 facets. The gimel is rishenis have 10 spheres within them. Malchus is just a point. Just a point, as he explained, that point is an absorber. It absorbs. It's a makabel, and it's in the sense, it is also in the sense of halah of iskaulus. Its entire thing is to be consumed by its source, like a nekuda in keser. That's the nekuda sakeser. The rotzen to be encompassed in the source. And then when Malchus is built out, it's also not building from itself. It's receiving the energy from Zah Mamaila. That's why Lesla Megamal Klum, which captures this concept, it has nothing of its own. And yet it channels everything. And then the second interpretation that it comes from the Aveda below, which ultimately also is the emphasis that's not Malchus itself, like a Melech, a Melech B'layam, needs the nation to actually generate and create Gili HaMalchus. So the very Nekudas HaMalchus that God created, but we we generate the very status of Malchus, and indeed, even more than that, even what Malchus receives from above, besides for the beginning of creation, when God created existence, that's when Malchus received from above. But afterwards, it comes through Araveda. After Adam Arishan, and then every year, Rosh Hashanah, and in general, Araveda is what triggers and puts on the switch of Malchus, which in turn draws down all the energies from above. As he explained, as we learned yesterday in the chapter on page 1363, this paragraph, that all comes through the Aveda, and even that which Malchus receives from higher than it, from Zah, and from the 10 spheres, like he explained in more detail on page 1364. So even though Malchus is the ultimate channeler and the ultimate creative, the process goes through Malchus, but it's all in a form, it's all coming Momailo or through the Halal, it's all not coming from itself, basically. Yeah. And that's why Malchus is like a Keli. I'm just going through the details here. So he went through, the Esses Spheres, Malchus, and inside Utzmusa, comes from the spheres. Ratzim B'Tainug. Okay. Okay, so let's now talk about the second half of the paragraph that we learned. So that's an overview of, in general, Malchus being the Makabel. Now, specifically, he spoke about both Momaila, meaning Malchus receiving the 10 spheres from above, and he said specifically that has to come from the Rotzen and Tainug, and also from the Chesed and Gvura. And he mentions right away Chesed and Gvura lehetiv l'nivroim, that Malchus has Chesed within it, the Chesed that he's doing kindness to his creation. And due to that, his rules, and yes, that's what that awakens, and that's Mamshich, the Malchus. Mati Elam Chesed Yevona, and he explained that Malchus, it's Hasnasas, the Malchus is Mepnei Oris Chesed Elyon Dezah, that causes it to want to desire to lead, because it's coming from a kindness that God wants to give to existence. So you see, Malchus alone doesn't have that. So that's why it again indicates that Malchus is receiving that chesed. And then, bottom line is, Amshachas Elu come through Allah, Asman Araveda. Ein Meller B'lei Am. So in the last parentheses, there on page 1364, he said, the point I made, in the beginning of creation, before man was created, Melucha was through Momaila. That did come from above, because there was no one there yet to crown God as king. There was no human being yet. So therefore, it was in a form of memshala, like we said, which is a minimal form. It's like a control more than governing or leadership. It's not really a relationship. It's like a one-way street. God runs the world. But Adam Arishan, he brought down the melucha. He brought from the vegetation. Yes, it's dependent on the human being plowing the earth. So Malchus on its own would not have Gili Oir. That's like the earth without human being plowing the earth and working the earth. And then comes Adam Arishan, who create the Yichud of Zumbim Kemo. Okay. So fine. That's the summary of that. So let me now elaborate on the last piece, where he comes back and says, okay, so after the human being exists, after the first Rosh Hashanah, and then subsequent to that, the rest of history, we below are the ones that draw down Malchus and draw down all the energies into Malchus. Because remember, for Malchus to really govern and have a relationship with us, it's not just Malchus. You need to have Keser, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, all in Malchus. So not just the Nakud of Malchus, you want to have the whole structure of Malchus. And all that is generated through us, through our work, Eimel B'layam, when we speak to God and say, we want a relationship with you. We're committed to you, completely committed. Kabbalah Shem Malchus Shemayim. And please be committed to us. That's the essence of Hachtaras HaMelech, crowning God as king. But then he goes back and says that it's not just the beginning of creation. Well, in addition to the fact that the first time it had to come from above because there was no human being to do all this. It's true, once God created man, a human being, and gave us the power to crown him as king and draw down all these energies, that's one thing. But the beginning, it had to come from Chesed Elyon. Now, this Chesed Elyon continues to be a force because even though it's coming from a Mata, but who gave us the power? And that's what the Rebbe Rashab adds. He says like this. I'm just reading it again. I'm going to explain it now more in detail from volume 2. You need to have the Chesed L'mayla. So something has to empower us. Why? Because we don't have power on our own. When you talk about a melech and a am below, like he says, Eina moshel demel and nimshel, in the moshel, it's not that way. The king and the people are two separate entities. So it makes sense. The king is dependent on the people to crown him as king. And without that, he's not a melech. But Lamaila, there are two things. First of all, we're not nifrad. We're not separate from God. Everything comes from him. And on who is he going to rule? On part of himself. Additionally, what value does our work have? What significance does it have? So all that tells us that God had to empower us with something that we wouldn't have on our own. It has to come from, and that's the Chesed Elyon, sheyitfis mokem avedas adam. That we should, number one, he doesn't say it explicitly, but clearly he means that we should be like a separate entity that crowns God as king, and that our work should matter. And we should be able to stimulate the Azgalos HaMelucha. So we left off is, okay, what's the explanation of that? Because what does that mean? Is that just some type of what's the word I want to use? Just type of cosmetic, illusion? That God is making us feel like we're important when we're really not. When it comes to a king and a nation below, it's true that with Ein Melech B'lo Yam, without his subjects, he's not a king. So what is God doing here? What's the Chesed doing? He's making us feel important. It's like God really doesn't need us, but he's making us feel good with his Chesed. He's a kind God. He's making us feel good. Obviously, that's not the pshat. It means that the Chesed Elyon is also actually empowering us with something that is unique, that really is a paradox ultimately, but obviously God has the power to do that. So let's talk for a moment about free will before I get into the details of the Chesed. The same question you could ask is about free will. How could we really have free will? And here is not the question of how do we have free will if God knows what we're going to do. That question has been answered by many commentaries and is published in many different places. The Rebbe explains it at length, because knowledge does not preclude will. You could know something, that doesn't mean your knowing affects it. If I know what you're going to do tomorrow, even if I'm a prophet, I know for sure what you're going to do tomorrow, then my knowledge does not affect you unless I force you to do it. If I hold your hand or I tell you this is what you're going to do. But if I know it silently within me, it's just like I know what happened yesterday didn't affect what happened yesterday. What I know will be tomorrow is because I have foresight. It's like a bird's eye view. I can see the future. So it's actually your actions tomorrow that are causing my knowledge today to know. But I don't want to go into that because it's a side subject. It's not relevant here. But the bigger question is not the knowledge of God. It's the God is everywhere. Eined Mulvade. Meaning that, like you said here, everything comes from him. Everything is part of him. So when you're doing something, an act, you're just an extension of you just don't feel godliness. But do you really have free will? And the answer is yes. Because God gave a part of his free will to us. The truth is, it doesn't make sense in a way, because everything in nature has a nature. You have to eat food. You have no free will. If you stop eating, God forbid, or drinking, it's going to affect you. So we are wired a certain way. Everything in existence has its rules, from the highest levels to the lowest levels. That concept of free will, Chassidus explains, comes Hein Adam Haya Adam Ke'achad Mimenu, where God said, I am giving a human being something that I have, which is only God, because he has no cause and has no personality, has no nature, and has no needs. Therefore, he has complete free will. There's nothing that compels him. He doesn't have to do this, doesn't have to do that. God, in his infinite capacity and his mysterious capacity, gave us a piece of that. That's a chesed. That's a pure chesed. He could have created us just like all other creatures of habit. A lion, a predator, prey, they have no choice. When they get hungry, or the way they are, that's the way. A blade of grass will always be a blade of grass. It will never change, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, it will never become something else. A human being has the capacity to go against their own nature. You may be tempted by something very powerfully, and you can control yourself. Also, the other way around. You may be a good person, and you can also do something very destructive. So we have the true capacity when it comes not to our personalities. You can't change the color of your eyes. You can't change your height. You can't change fundamentals about your very genetic makeup. But the choices of good and evil and right and wrong, you have choice. It's a big question. There are those that argue, scientists, Laplace was a famous French thinker who claimed at the end of the 19th century, he said, the only reason we can't predict human behavior is because we don't have all the data. Give me all the data on a person's personality, and I can predict everything that person is going to do from the moment they're born till they die. Now, it would seem to make sense. It's data. If you put all the data in about, let's say, the chemical makeup of a piece of wood or water, you can predict all possibilities. So why can't you say the same thing about a human being? The only thing is we don't have all the data. Now, when he came out with that statement, that was considered heresy. The church, they wanted to excommunicate him. I don't know if they had any power any longer, but it was considered a heretical, because he was basically taking away, saying that all of us are robot machines. We're just complex machines. There's no such thing as free will. It's an illusion. Now, the response was, first of all, that's what he said. It doesn't mean he was right. Some argue that once quantum mechanics came on the scene, with something we discovered the world of probability and uncertainty and states of amorphous states that have not defined indeterministic states. So some argued, one second, today we know that's even in science, it's not that way. Yes, there are things that are absolutely predictable, especially on the macroscopic level, but there are things that are absolutely not predictable. I'm not going to get into whether it really helps us understand free will or not, but one thing is for sure, science today does not think that everything is in a state of determinism. That if a light can be a wave and a particle, and it can be determined by the person who's observing it. The point I want to make, I just want to go back to, is that the idea of free will is a chiddush. I mean, one of the Jewish cynics, Isaac Bashevis Singer, said, "We must believe in free will. We have no choice." So that's like part of the irony of it. But on a serious level, free will is a gift from God to us, because it would on its own it wouldn't be that way. Just like the winter comes, and then comes the spring, and then summer, and then autumn, and then winter again. There's no choice. This is the way it's good. The sun rises every morning exactly the same way, the same time. I mean, it's not the same moment. I mean, but scheduled, and we can predict it forever. And if we can't predict it, it's because we don't have all the information. So you'd think a human being is the same way, but that's not, because it's a Chesed Elyon. And it's true. It's similar to what it says in the Geras HaKodesh, that God gave us also another gift. Mitzius Matzmuse. The fact that we're a yesh and we feel self-contained, as if nothing created us. You don't feel something created you. You believe it. You may know it. It may make sense, because nothing can create itself. But nobody feels. You don't feel you're an extension of godly energy. Just like you don't feel you're an extension of your mother or your father, even though you came from them. Why? So you could say, that's fine. That's our feeling. Says the Alter Rebbe in the Geras HaKodesh, one of the last things he wrote before his istalkus, before he passed away, that the fact that we feel that we have no ila v'siba, no cause, comes from Atzmus, who really has no cause. because nothing cause is causeless. God is mitziyuse matzmuse. His existence comes from within himself. His reality dictates his existence. In our case, existence comes after there's a reason we exist. We don't have to exist. But God gave some of that emes of being an existence that senses that it's like self-made, that comes from Atzmus. That's also a gift. Now, we have to be wise to use it properly and not to misuse it. When we misuse it, we say, I'm a self-made man, and do whatever I like. There's no God, there's no nothing. We have to be wise, and God said, I trust you that you'll use your free will, and you'll use the pieces of Atzmus, that so-called component of Atzmus. I'm hesitating using the word component because it's not really accurate words, but that aspect of Atzmus that he gave us, that we'll use it and direct it toward the right thing. And ultimately, when Mashiach comes, in the words of Chesed that the Rebbe cites quite often, especially in later years, that the Yesh HaNivra will become one with the Yesh HaMiti, that will recognize that our sense of independence and independent consciousness, as if we are self-made, really is rooted in the Mitzusim Atzmusi of Atzmus. Now I'm elaborating because all this tells us that there is indeed something happening here that defies logic. Because logically, it doesn't make sense. If I build a table, the table is going to do what I want it to do. This table has no independence. This table can't just do whatever it wants. It's built by a certain way. And here God created a human being with something of himself that gives the human choice, free will. Now I spoke about Mitzusim Atzmusei. And now if you think about that, that ultimately leads it to understand that's why our avodah matters. Even though on one hand you say God is complete and perfect, what does he need us for? What are we adding? Chas v'shalom to say that God is lacking something. But he wanted it, not because he's lacking. Not everything. When we want something, it's usually because we're lacking it. Why do I want something? Because I don't have it, unless I want it, unless I get it. By God, it was not due to lack, it was due to desire. We will never understand why, because it's beyond logic. That's what he desired. After he desired it, he also made it in a way that it makes sense. It makes sense to come in Tachtenim, where it's completely a world that's hostile and defies God, and to recognize godliness. But does he get more complete because of it? You can't speak in that language, because God is complete and he doesn't need anything. But he wants it. And once he wants it, it's real. And what is the reality? That we have power. We have the power to draw down Gili Malchus down below, and that our work with Tefes Mokim matters. That's what God wants. And that, he says, is coming from a Chesed Elyon. So even though, like he says, originally, it could have not been that way, but it is that way. So even when Avodah Sa'adam, the Halas Manas creates Malchus, that's also getting strength, and it's been empowered by Chesed Elyon. So essentially, what he's coming back is, before he was speaking that Malchus gets all its energy from Zah. Okay, it has nothing of its own. So now Malchus, the moon, is receiving from the sun, and it shines to earth. Then after Adam was created, and after our Avodah, now we generate that Malchus. Malchus in turn draws down. In other words, we get the moon so-called stimulated. The moon in turn draws it from Malchus, from Zah. But he's adding, no, the Chesed Elyon also empowers the Avodah from below. That doesn't mean our Avodah is not Avodah. It's just important to remember that it was God that empowered us to have this free will. He doesn't use the word free will here, so let's use the language he does use here. The power to crown God as king, even though in reality we're not separate from him, but he made a reality that it would be separate and not as an illusion, and that we have the power that our avodah is Tefes Mokim. Now, what still needs to be explained, are we separate or are we not separate? Is that, how could you say both? So let me just quote something I already spoke about a number of times, where this is a sikha from the Rebbe, Mishpatim Tovshin Chav Zayin. And it's on Tanya, the end of chapter 4. I read about it in Torah Meaningful Life as well, in the chapter on, I think, on God or a unity, probably. Or God or unity, one of those two chapters. And the Rebbe really addresses this issue very directly. He asked the question, which I'm bringing it not just to help understand this parentheses, but also you'll see it's very connected to Ein Oid. And here's the meaning. Here's how to connect. The Rebbe says there that the Alter Rebbe says, after he brings about Hagodl v'Hagibur, remember that there's God's Chesed is the Oir, God Gili Elikus, but God concealed himself, where he says there that every second, every moment, creation is created by God. So why don't we feel it? He says there that even if we were able to see it, all of existence would disappear. So he said because God has another power. It's called the power to conceal. And that power to conceal doesn't allow us to see the divine energy that's energizing us every moment. And he goes, Shemesh U'Mogen Hashem Elikim. Havaya and Elikim, very much the themes that we're learning in Ayin Beis. Havaya is Gilui, the Shemesh, the sun. Mogen is the shield or the sheath that conceals. And then he continues and explains that the mashal is not Daimel and Nimshal, because the sun is not, the earth is not within the sun. Existence is all within godliness. So then he goes on to explain that that's what the Tzimtzum has the power to do, to create a reality that feels, and in reality is like it's outside of the divine. Truly it's not, but this reality is also true. So in a sense, there's both realities. From God's perspective, everything is all part of God's unity. But God created another perspective that's also real. And the Alter Rebbe concludes chapter 4 in Tanya, and he says, Ki hatzimtzum nikra kelim, because the tzimtzum is called kelim. And the Rebbe, in a very powerful, this is one of the Rebbe's main contributions, one of the unique contributions in Chesed that you see from the Rebbe, in this Rabrengen, Mishpatim Tavshin Chav Zayin, which has been published already a number of times. And as I said, I adapted in brief in my book, Torah Meaning for Life. The Rebbe explains, what is the Alter Rebbe coming to add that Tzimtzum Nikra Kelim? And the Rebbe goes on to say, he's coming to say that the Tzimtzum is not an illusion. If the Tzimtzum was just a concealment, period, then it's a matter of just absence of light. But then there's fundamental questions that have to be asked. Like I asked them yesterday, if that's the case, for somebody where the tzimtzum didn't affect them, they see the godliness in everything, you could say, so what's the point of Torah and mitzvahs? For them, there's no concealment. What's the point of Mashiach coming? For Mashiach is just revealing that which was already there. But once the Alter Rebbe says tzimtzum nikra kelim, that means the concealment itself has substance. It's not just the absence of something else. It has real substance. The same God that manifests in divine consciousness manifests in concealment. So there's a godly power there. Hein Vureso. This is God's power. Like we learned earlier, Hela Ma'atzmi is not just absence of light. It's an actual entity. Why? Because God is not bound to revelation. Even though it makes sense that God should be revealed and so on. So the thing is, in other words, when God conceals, he truly conceals because he's revealing another force of his, which is the power to not shine, to not reveal. So that reality that's created from it is a true reality. So the reality of our experience is God's consciousness. We experience the divine presence. That's very true. Tzaddikim feel that. So that's in that place. But then God created another reality called the reality of existence, that's driven by his power to conceal, and that power is kalim. It's substance. Kalim is not just an absence of something. Kalim is substance. So even tzaddikim through the tzimtzum, when they do a mitzvah, they're also transforming the substance of the concealment of existence, and ultimately reveal the divine even in the helam, even in the kalim. I'm being very brief, but that's the point that the Rebbe made, that the fact that we don't see godliness is not just because we're weak and blind, but it's because there's an actual God gave power to concealment and made a concealment a true entity. It's like the difference, remember the two opinions about cheshech. Is darkness just the absence of light, or is darkness an entity of its own? Ultimately, it's an entity of its own, and therefore creates a true reality, the reality of a divine concealment. So in other words, God is not limited to revelation. That's the bottom line. And when we transform it, that's ultimately the transformation of the tzimtzum, avayu elikim. that we see that the Kalim themselves are also godly power. Ultimately, to the level of Einoid, that they actually reveal the Helam Ha'atzmi. Not just that they reveal the light that they're meant to reveal, but that they themselves reveal the Helam Ha'atzmi. So based on that, then based on this explanation, you can understand that this isn't just an illusion. This isn't a game. That God said, you know what, since I'm kind, I'll make you feel like you're important. No, we actually have a certain fundamental independence, as expressed, as I explained, with free will and so on. And we have the fundamental capacity to do something that is meaningful, not just to us, but also to God. Because what you're doing is revealing in the God's power that transcends revelation, you're revealing even there the godliness. That too is a godly power, the power of creating Tzimtzum and Kalim and Helam and so on. That's briefly the explanation of what this means when we say the Chesed Elyon is giving us that power. It's a true power that's coming. Now, I wouldn't have explained it if it was not necessary, because it is pshat here, even though this is not the theme. The Rebbe Rashab here is focusing on Malchus and Makabel, but it is necessary to understand these last few lines in the parentheses. What is the Chesed Elyon? Now, if you read, I don't know if any of you looked up the pages I shared with you on yesterday, volume 2, in the Maimorim. I don't remember the exact pages now again. I know it's Vayikra and Sav. Yeah, it's page 911 through the end of the Maimon and Sav, I believe, through page 924. 924. And then again, what was the second set of pages I gave?
970. 965, 966, and then 971, 972 specifically.
Right. So there, first I was going to read it there, but I summed up already what it says. But there he explains how it all starts from the Chesed, but then God actually gives us the power. That it comes, Halah Asman has actual power. What was the last 2 pages that you just said? The main 2 pages?
971 to 972.
Right. I said 971, 72. You sure?
Yeah. Well, first you said 965.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
966.
Good. Yeah. That's correct. 965, 966. He says it clearly here. Yeah. And then, 971, 972. Correct. So we can go through the details there, but I think since I gave you the pages and I explained it now, I don't have to go read it now there. And if you have any questions about what it says there, I'm happy to respond. So I'll give you a little homework. You can look it up. If you like to read it, feel free. Then we can talk about it. Okay, with that, I think I did some justice to explaining this. But since you may have questions, let's stop here. So really, so far reviewed just everything we learned yesterday with some explanation till the end of the paragraph on page 1364. That's where we are right now. Anybody wants to comment, questions, anything? Okay. Does that mean it's so clear, or it means it's so confusing? If you don't mind telling me.
It's a little confusing. Let me ask, what is the connection between Chesed Elyon? I know you just spent 20 or 25 minutes talking about it, but how Dafka is Chesed Elyon relating to free will, to giving us a choice? What is it about that? I mean, I'm not sure I understand the connection, just Dafka Chesed.
Chesed simply God in his kindness gave us a gift. Gave us something that we wouldn't have on our own. In other words, what Alter Rebbe Rashab is qualifying, that though he said that our Halah Asman, our Avodah does it all, he's explaining that itself also needs something from Lamaila. He says, even Avodah Sa'adam, that's the words he uses. The words exactly, he said like this, that our avodah should actually stimulate Malchus and have an impact above. That's the point.
That we have that power.
It's a gift. It's essentially a chesed. It doesn't come from itself. It comes from because God gave it to us, this chesed.
So it's a it's a metaphor for free choice.
No, what's the metaphor?
Well, that in his the supernal
God
kindness,
gave us a gift of free choice. He gave us a gift.
Right, but
he endowed us with the power of free will. What do you mean by metaphor? It's not a metaphor at all. Free will is real.
Chesed is kindness, elyon, above.
God in his generosity and his kindness gave us free will. What? I'm not clear what you're asking.
The phrase itself doesn't mean free will. That's all I meant. Chesed elyon doesn't.
Is kindness of God. I explained.
Right.
In this case, the kindness of God is that He gave us the power that our effort should stimulate Malchus, and that our Veda should be Tefes Malkum, should be significant.
Should matter. Yeah.
That's the language here. If you don't want to use free will, it's fine. I explained it for the class, for those that will help understand the whole idea of the paradox. But you don't want to use free will, it's fine. It doesn't use free will in the mimer here, so it's perfectly fine. We don't need to use it. It's not necessary to understand this.
Yeah, I understand the point. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I'll continue reading. Let's continue learning. Right? The last line, okay. Key thing to remember, the Malchus in general is not a mashpia. And let's explain what mashpia means. Mashpia means gilui, revelation, and that it has its own self-contained power to emanate, to transmit. And it has what to transmit. Malchus is a carrier, a channeler that channels from above and is stimulated from below. So with that, the Rebbe Rashab is now going to take us back, where all the way back to the beginning of the topic, which began on page 1357. So as you see in 1357, he said, Abira Inyan, we need to preface the idea that Malchus has nothing of its own. And that began the long discussion that we have now learned, 57 till 64. So we're talking about 7 pages. But before that, what was he talking about before that? So if you recall, he was talking about the difference between Mashpia and Makabel, which is Zon Malchus, and I'm going backwards now, to page 1355. So the truth is, we're really following up 1355. What did he say in 1355? That's where he spoke about the 3 types of Makabel. Remember, Mashpia, Mashpia, that's the sun. What are the 3 types of Makabel? Light of the moon, the light of a bright stone, a luminous, precious stone, and the light that comes through our eyesight. And he explained the difference between them, that each one is something that the other doesn't have. So now he's going to come back to understand that. The 3 levels in Malchus, which is all based on the Maimer Ve'inenu Me'iris of the Mittler Rebbe that's not been published yet. So if you go back to page 1352, you'll see that he said, V'nirali levayra inyan, he starts with Eir Hariyah, the light of vision, of sight. And he went through those few pages till page 1355, where he explained that Ohr Hariyah has a weakness compared to the moon in two things. When your eyesight, even though the light, your eyes are bright and can see, but they don't shine through the darkness. The moon shines even in the darkness. And the second thing, that the eyesight, even if you see something with the candle burning in one room, it doesn't carry over to another room. Whereas the moon continues to shine light even in the night on its own. It's drawing from the sun, and it's because the sun triggered it. That was the difference. And then the bright stone had a different thing altogether. That assumes the properties of the sunlight and the stars, and some of them actually shine even in a dark room, but it's not like a moon. It's not a mo'er. It doesn't have the capacity to illuminate. It's just bright. It has the property of brightness in it. That's what we spoke about back then. And then it shines on its own light. Ayin Beis, I'm reading on top of page 1355. It's an assumed light. It acquired the light from the sun, and it can shine also in the dark. And Agimel Ohr Hariyah, that does not have, it's not an Ohr HaMeir. It's not a light that shines to another, only to itself, and it constantly needs another light to be a siyua, a support. If it's a dark room, the eye cannot see on its own. And all of these are Ohr Makabel, and Ohr Hashem is Shu B'chinas Ohr Mashpia. That was the end of the paragraph from 1355. Then he said, "V'adugma mekol zeh." He went to Zah and Malchus, Dimsti Mashpia and Makabel, and from there he went to what we've been learning, Lesla Magamo Klum, the way Malchus works. And now he's going to go back to the three types of Ohr Makabel. That's the context and the flow. So now we're returning back to what we last learned on page 1355. So it's almost 9 pages back. Okay. Omnom, so new paragraph on page 1364. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Omnom yesh bezeh gimel madreges. What's bezeh? What he just said. Malchus, it's Ohr Makabel. So now, however, there are 3 levels in this Ohr Makabel. In Malchus. Ve'hein al derech moshel, and they're like in it, for example, Eir halavona, the light of the moon, ve'eir eventev, and the light of the bright stone, ve'eir riyas ha'ayin, and the light of the vision of the eyesight. So now the next pretty long section, if I recall correctly, this goes for a good maybe 100 pages. He's going to be explaining what these 3 levels in the Ohr Makabel are in Ruchnius. If I recall correctly, I'll tell you exactly where he comes back to it. Quite a while. Let me see. I think it goes all the way till. Well, Riyas Ayin is on page 1454. Let me see. We're definitely talking to around close to 90 to 100 pages, if I recall correctly. Yeah, something like that. And then he's going to go back to Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Ohr. Yeah. Okay. So now, just keep in mind, so this is now going to be a very extensive discussion on these 3 types of Ohr halavona, rather Makabel. So he starts. I'll go a few lines into it. The Isa b'Ksavim, and it's we find in Ksavim, in the writings, the manuscripts. Now, this is not an expression you find very often. but it usually refers to the Maimorim of the Rabbeim that were not published. When they're published, the Rebbe Rashab tells us where they're published. So which Ksavim is this? This is the Maimer that I'm referring to. It's called Ve'enenu Me'ires. Ke'er ha'lavona, ke'er ha'chama, ke'er ha'lavona, ke'er ha'yireach. So there's a Maimer from the Mittler Rebbe on this verse. I do have the Maimer. I have a bootleg copy, so to speak, but it was never published.
Even not today?
I'm sorry?
Even not today?
Still not published, no.
How long is it? Pretty long, I'll bet.
No, it is. I don't think it's very long.
Could you post
Usually
it?
Mittler Rebbe's Maimorim are quite long. This one, if I recall correctly, not that long. I have to see if I have permission to share it, but bottom line is, it's this Maimer is from the Mittler Rebbe. It's based on a Maimer with the same beginning in the Siddur. And I'm sorry, there's a Maimori Admur Azokin on Siddur and Maimori Azal, page 460 and on. It's based on that, but the details are far more in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So Isa B'Ksavim is from that Maimer. So he says like this: these three levels of Er Makabel, Shehein Begimel El, Isa B'Ksavim Shehein Begimel El Mizbiyah. They are these three levels, the three worlds of Bria, Yitzira, Asiya. The Malchus, the Bria, since it's all Malchus, the Malchus of Bria, Kamoi B'chinas Levana, it's like the level of the moon. Or Malchus Yitzira, Kamoi B'chinas Evan. The Malchus of Yitzira is like the stone, the bright stone. Or Malchus Asiya, B'chinas Ayin. And the Malchus of Asiya is the level of the light of the eye. So now, basically, Malchus has all three, but now he's breaking it to Malchus of Bria, Malchus of Yitzira, Malchus of Asiya. V'noat sefer b'tchilasan, and the end is wedged in the beginning. We always say the last level is connected with and wedged in the beginning. The no sefer b'tchilasan, no tchilasan b'sefer. She'b'chinas Malchus d'Asiya. Then the lowest level, Malchus of Asiya, which corresponds to the eye, to vision, has within it a reflection of a very high level that's higher than even Malchus of Bria. So even though in the hierarchy, Malchus of Bria is higher than Malchus of Asiya, but because the rule that the lower something goes, the higher it's rooted, so the last level of the vision has something that's even higher than the moonlight of the Malchus of the world of Bria. Okay. I'm going to stop here for now till tomorrow, because now he's going to start explaining, based on what we learned, the difference between these three in the Er Makabel itself. He's going to now start applying it to Torah. You're going to see he's going to bring that these three levels all refer to three levels of Er in Torah. That's going to be the next section. But first, he's going to sum up the difference between the three. And then if you look at the bottom of the page, he says, Yesh Levayda Inyan, the difference between Bri, Yitzir, Asiya is Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud. So we're going to find a fascinating connection to the three parts of Torah: Mikra, which is Chumash, Torah Shebiksav; Mishnah, which is Torah Shebapeh, but is the Tanoim, the Mishnah, the Mishnayos; and Talmud is the Gemara. That these correspond to, that Talmud is going to be Bria, Mishnah, Yitzira, and Mikra Basiya, even though it seemed to be the other way around, but we'll learn about this. So that's where this is going now. Just giving you the lay of the land. So he's going to explain the difference between these three types of Oir, Makabel, and how they apply in Torah. And the next section is going to be at length. He's going to go through the difference between three types of the three dimensions in Torah in the context of the Oir Makabel, which of course is coming to teach us how through our learning Torah and the different levels, we can elevate through these Oyer Makabel, and reach the higher levels of Oyer in general, the Mashpia, all the way to the levels that we learned, Helama Atzmi, etc., etc. So you can buckle your seatbelts. This is beginning. You can call this pretty much, if you are marking, it's a place where I fold the page, the beginning of another subsection. Obviously, it's all one long flow, but it's a new topic, new ideas that we're going to enter into. So this is like a transition page as we now move into the next level of understanding what Makabel Malchus is in the context of Torah and so on. So I'm going to stop here by the line, fourth line in the new paragraph on page 1364. Any questions? Anybody wants to say anything? Okay.